All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about the delays. We're still getting used to the virtual format. My name is Peter Day. I'm a part of the executive team here at the Canadian International Council's Halifax branch, and I'd like to welcome you from all across Canada to international development in a post-pandemic world, coordinated by our branch and the Atlantic Council for International Cooperation, who we are very happy to partner with this afternoon. The ACIC is a coalition of individuals, organizations, institutions working in the Atlantic region, which are committed to achieving global sustainability in a peaceful and healthy environment with social justice, human dignity, and participation for all. The CIC, with 16 branches across the country, is a platform for citizens to engage in discussions on international issues and Canada's place in the world. Both councils can be found online and on social media. So if you find yourself enjoying tonight's event, I encourage you to either get in touch for more information or consider becoming a member at the link that we are about to post. For tonight, your videos are turned off and your sound is muted. The full event will be recorded and shared, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions. There should be a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions to the panelists. And you can also vote for questions posed by other members of the audience, and you will see those as they come in. We are delighted to have tonight's e-panel discussion hosted by Dr. Colin Dodds, who is a former president of St. Mary's University, treasurer and board member of WUSC, and an active executive member of CIC Halifax. So without any further ado, Dr. Dodds, feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Pete. So can everybody hear me? Pete, can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Good. So good afternoon to everybody. I'm joined by three panelists this afternoon who have a wealth of experience in international development and perspectives for the future. So the format is I'm going to limit each speaker to 7 minutes to give us maximum time for Q&A. And we will be, as Pete mentioned, conducting a poll during this event. So let me very briefly introduce each of our panelists to give maximum time for their words and for Q&A. Starting with Shelagh Savage, who is a lecturer at Dalhousie University in the International Development Studies program, close to 30 years of international development experience, involving also the Coady Institute at St. Francis of Xavier, extensive, therefore innovative program experience. Secondly, Fadi Al Qassar, originally from Jordan. He co-founded and is the executive director of Venture 2 Impact, creating voluntary opportunities for people, which grew out of an event he started in 2006 for international development volunteering. And the third speaker is Chris Eaton, Executive Director of WUSC, World University Services Canada, again with 30 years, or over 30 years of experience in international development work. His first posting was as a volunteer in Lesotho with WUSC. So I'm going to ask Shelagh first. So I will now ask Chris actually first. I'm going to ask Chris first to speak, followed by Shelagh, followed by Fadi. So Chris, I'm over to you, please, and I'm going to time you for 7 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for this opportunity. We are an organization that's dedicated to creating economic education and empowerment opportunities for youth, particularly refugees and young women. So I want to center my analysis on all of that. We've been doing a lot of planning around what COVID will mean for our programming and for Canada's presence and programming globally during the pandemic and following the pandemic. I think our first analysis would be that the impact, particularly the social and economic impact of this crisis, is going to be longer, deeper, and wider than any of us initially anticipated, and that we actually have to plan in that context. First and foremost, we would say that there's going to be an economic crisis, and that economic crisis is going to affect states and state capacity quite a bit. It's driven in part by those countries that are dependent upon the exports of commodities or manufactured goods to the global north, for which the demand for which is going to go down. And that will affect these countries' abilities to invest in health and education systems, may even cause some additional crises related to their sovereign debt. And so there's a big piece there that we have to worry about in terms of the capacity of the countries that we're concerned about to continue to invest in those sectors that we as an organization operate in. At the same time, we know that this is going to be a crisis that will affect the employment of young people, employment more broadly, as demand for their services, of course, is constrained, goes down. Of course, a large number of people in the countries that we work in the informal sector and are relatively precarious situations, and they will be particularly affected by this crisis, both in the short and the longer term. From our perspective, what this means is that there has to be kind of a reinvestment in terms of the updated skills that people will need to participate in markets as they go forward. And the big challenge there in many instances, in terms of the partners, the institutions that we work with, is a disconnect between the training and educational opportunities, employment educational opportunities that are being offered, and the markets to which young people participate in. And so there has to be done a whole lot of work in that regard. And that's an area that Canada has exceeded in and could be a future area for reinvestment. At the same time, we have to think about the social protection of all of those people who are being affected by this crisis, for which we have really good examples of conditional and non-conditional cash transfers done at state levels, done at subnational levels, done through various education, health programs, all kinds of different ways. This is an area that Canada hasn't done a whole lot of work in, but is an area that is particularly important and relevant to the current context. Within the education sphere, what we're worried about is that there's going to be a whole generation of people who are going to be kind of affected by the crisis and permanently behind. What we know from other kinds of crises is that those who are already vulnerable, particularly girls, and not only girls, are most at risk of being permanently affected by this crisis. And so from our perspective, we need to kind of reinvest in the education ladder, pre-primary, primary, secondary, and post-secondary, and have an enhanced kind of focus both on that social protection aspect for access to educational opportunities, and an increased focus on the quality of the education that is particularly relevant to these kinds of people. One of the things I think that we're thinking is that, there are opportunities, online opportunities, remote IT opportunities that are both in the employment and the education spheres. But I guess our perspective is that's not going to generate huge amounts of employment, nor is ed tech a technology that is particularly relevant to the most marginalized communities that we deal with. We just don't feel that it's there yet. We are particularly concerned also about refugees. What we know is that the crisis is going to cause a lot of disruption in a lot of places, potentially leading to greater numbers of people migrating, and also a reluctance to both resettle, integrate, or repatriate, voluntary repatriation of large numbers of people. So you're going to have an increasingly large number of people who are going to be affected by this crisis, who are displaced. At the same time as we're closing borders, there is this rise of populism, xenophobia is on the rise in many instances. This is an area where Canada has done some very good work domestically and can and has done some really good work, can do more work in terms of promoting the complementary pathways for refugees globally. I think this is a particular area of opportunity for us. It builds upon our private sponsorship model, and it also relates to both employment pathways as well as education pathways for refugees. Should Canada do more? How is Canada going to do more? Of course we should. We can. And it's probably more needed now than ever from my perspective. I guess the thing that I would say is that we should try not to do that alone. We need to do that with a coalition of both global civil society organizations and states themselves that are particularly concerned about the global response to the crisis that we are facing. So those are some of my initial thoughts. I have many other comments that I could make on other aspects of both Canada's architecture and how we're thinking about issues as well.
Thank you, Chris. So Shelagh, you're next, please.
Thank you very much, Colin and Chris. Will international development look different after COVID? Absolutely, it has to look different. There's been a lot of talk about building back better, but building back doesn't mean building back the same. And I think that this is a really important transformative opportunity for us to think differently about many, many different things related to international development. COVID-19 has not only exacerbated climate change, gender equality, human rights, food security, and global health issues amongst many others, but it has also starkly shown those fault lines related to inequality. And we're seeing that both in the global south and we're seeing it in North America. As Canadians, we have a responsibility to address that inequity, and I think most importantly, we have to think differently about how we do that. This is an opportunity right now to think differently. Like many people, I have many more questions than answers, so what I'm sharing today are a few personal reflections from my perspective of work, mainly in civil society. So community-based, small and medium organizations and learning institutions, both formal and informal, but all through the lens of equitable partnership. How can we be better utilizing Canadian resources? Well, I think we need to be looking at what are the Canadian resources? We've got Canadian government and we've also got Canadian civil society. In terms of Canada's strength and assets from a government perspective, I think we've seen that the government of Canada has quite interestingly stepped up in response to the COVID-19 crisis and given some fairly significant contributions. In March, there was an initial $8 million for humanitarian aid. In April, there was $159.5 million to the UN. Again, in May, we had another $650 million to Gavi for international vaccinations and polio eradication. And then later again in May, we had a further $360 million for NGOs and multilaterals, all to be able to do things in response to the COVID-19 crisis. These are huge and generous commitments. However, mainly those are coming from within existing official development assistance budgets. And I think what else we can do, we can actually strive to meet targets that were set many years ago and that we continue to push towards of 0.7% for GNI. And we can also champion other forms of support, such as debt relief. Those are the financial resources that we have from the Canadian government. We also have some very interesting policy frameworks from the Canadian government. We've got the Feminist International Assistance Policy, which puts gender equality and the most vulnerable at the core. I think this has been used very effectively to date, but there's an opportunity now to be even bolder with this and to actually really put gender equality at the center of everything we do. I was very encouraged to hear Minister Gould on May 12th at a town hall with Canadian CSOs talk about the need to think in non-hierarchical ways that are consistent with that Feminist International Assistance Policy. We know that Global Affairs Canada is not always very non-hierarchical, but I think that this is an opportunity to think about how we can really be feminist in how we approach international aid and international development. Another amazing policy that Global Affairs Canada has is the policy for Csl Partnership, which outlines ways in which Global Affairs can engage and ideally strengthen civil society organizations in the Global South and in Canada. And there has been some very good work done on that, but now is the chance to be even bolder in thinking how we can look at collaboration and partnership differently. In terms of another asset that we have in Canada is the civil society community that we have, with huge and strong relationships, networks, partnerships across sectors and across the North and the South. And I think we need to be thinking as civil society about how we can step up more in that. In terms of new models and approaches to support government and civil society, there are three areas that I think that we can be thinking about. One is that I think we can learn across and within sectors. We haven't always been as good about doing that, and there are some really interesting models out there for measuring collective impact, how small organizations can collectively contribute more effectively together than on their own. And there's some interesting models in mental health approaches across Canada, and also different kinds of alliances and networks, including the ICN or the Inter-Council Network, different ways of working that don't always include the traditional NGO approach. So that's one thing we can be doing. We can be learning across and within sectors. The other thing I think we can be doing is making stronger connections between civil society actors, both individuals and organizations, stronger connections with government, with multilaterals, with private sector. I think we've seen that there have been some very creative community and individual responses to COVID-19, whether that's in Canada with distilleries stepping up to start making hand sanitizers, or whether it's in the Global South where you've got women's self-employment organizations suddenly switching to sewing masks instead of the traditional things that they sewed. So how can we support these individual and collective responses and connect them with the government and the international multilateral responses? We can't have one or the other. I think we need both, but I think it's not just a coordination between that, but thinking about new forms and new ways of connecting that. So it's not just governments, or it's not just individuals and communities, but a way of thinking differently about that. Perhaps a new form or multilateral organization is the way to go. And again, I was really encouraged to hear Minister Gould talking about co-chairing with the UK a group of like-minded international development ministers. So thinking about new types of multilateral institutions, I think this is an opportunity. And then finally, I think perhaps most importantly, I think we really need to think differently about how we work together in order to work together better. As Chris mentioned, we can't do this alone. And May 29th, the UN Financing for Development meeting, a lot of people, including Prime Minister Trudeau, talked about the only way to rebuild is to work together better. And we have an even greater responsibility now to think about how to do that. Effective development results don't preclude equitable development results. And I think the importance of working together in different ways is an important result in and of itself. How can we measure success differently? We need to measure the difference that is made by work that's being done, but I think we also need to measure how we work together in order to do that. And CETA's leadership of the results-based management approach in the early aid effectiveness days was very crucial. And wouldn't it be great if Global Affairs Canada had the leadership and the resources and the support to develop new metrics for measuring such things as equitable partnership, mutual respect, trust, and organizational autonomy? I think it's also really important that these responsibilities we recognize are not just government or civil society, but both. And as civil society, we really have to seriously rethink our own roles and partnerships, thinking now about when do we need to step up in new ways, and sometimes when do we need to step aside. I'd like to close with a reflection from a very wise woman leader from Ethiopia, who talks about equitable and inclusive collaboration, offering the opportunity for disagreement and not always saying yes, and the importance of ongoing and messy conversations as we continue to work through these things. And so I'd like to thank CIC and ACIC for this afternoon's contribution to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. Now we're going to have a poll, which is going to pop up on your screen soon with a question. And here it is. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you can, if you want to answer that question, this was just referred to actually by Sheila in terms of the UN target, that we are in fact below that particular target. So, can we now move on to our third speaker, which is Fadi. So Fadi, please, can you give us your perspective and experience, particularly, I know, on the volunteering side?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much, Colin. And before I address the three main questions, I wanted to give some information about my perspective, my experience, and where I'm coming from. So I run a small nonprofit organization in Halifax. We connect techies from companies like Salesforce, Netflix, Microsoft, Google, and a host of other tech companies with communities and organizations that need their skills but can never pay for them or access them because they're too disconnected or isolated. Our work is focused on education, economic development, and empowerment, and it's primarily done through in-person skill-based volunteering programs, which means a team of skilled professionals from San Francisco, LA, New York would travel physically to Romania, Rwanda, Nepal, or any of the countries where we work to deliver our programs. So first off, if you've been impacted, I hear you, I see you. Our work and our programs have been specifically impacted by this crisis. Secondly, I'm here speaking for the little guy of international development, organizations that have under $1 or $2 million in operational budget, under 10 staff, organizations that have blended financial models, including government, regular donors, corporate, etc. And I took a bit of a tactical approach to my answers. So as far as in terms of thinking, how will the international development space change post pandemic? You know, I started with thinking this space is complex to begin with, and post-pandemic, it's going to get even more complex. According to the World Bank, 49 million people are going to be pushed into extreme poverty this year alone due to COVID-19. And there's going to be a lot of pressure on local NGOs, government, international communities to respond to a whole host of things: education, healthcare, employment, security, migration, and just a lot of different issues. And so I think in a post-COVID world, we must invest in advancing the tech revolution for local NGOs and communities, but specifically for local staff and local NGOs. They're experiencing more needs in their communities, but are struggling technologically or financially to meet these needs. And for us, we see a lot of issues on digital with our partner organizations and local staff. And part of our work includes local staff training. And I think in the future, it's going to become more of a primary focus of our work. So not just training the end beneficiary, the young single mother in Rwanda, or the child in Romania that's transitioning out of institutional orphanages, but also empowering the local staff to be able to do the work that they do. Because at the end of the day, when a crisis happens, when a global pandemic happens, they are the hands and feet on the ground, and they're the ones that are going to get the call first. So they need to be equipped, empowered to deliver the programs, no matter the situation, because as a small organization, we can't always be there. In terms of how does Canada utilize its resources, I love a good feedback loop. And whenever I'm traveling, I see a lot of Canadians everywhere. And there's a lot of Canadians involved in the international development space, lots of Canadians running NGOs abroad. I have many friends who are involved in running foreign NGOs as Canadian citizens. And so it would be really interesting to figure out a way to kind of reach out to as many Canadians abroad as possible who are involved in the international development space to really understand what are the challenges that they're experiencing, what are the trends that they're seeing, and the themes. And based on that, it'd be a really good place for us as an ecosystem or a space to start wrestling with these issues based on real feedback from Canadians on the ground, from NGOs on the ground, and from people who are in the trenches, because I think that will allow us to move in a way that is inclusive and that's really data-driven, just focusing on the most pressing issues that folks are experiencing due to this crisis today. In terms of new approaches and innovative models, I think what I'm learning is that it's our responsibility to really be focused, again, from a tactical perspective, on helping organizations and communities develop entrepreneurial ventures as part of our development work. We must upskill people, invest in the startup ecosystem in the countries where we're working, and devote resources to help people become income earners, business owners, and employers in their own communities. I think development needs to move forward towards a more wholesome approach, and the goals for sustainability and empowerment should be clearer than ever. And for us, an example of that is catalyzing the local entrepreneurship ecosystem. So these are just some kind of high-level thoughts, and maybe I can end there and just field any questions that anyone has.
Thank you very much, Fadi. Now we're going to have a second poll, please. The second question. So does Canadian aid to developing countries support Canada's interests in security, trade, migration, health, and economic stability? So whilst you're completing that, I have had a few questions that have come forward. And the first is a sort of fairly provocative one that deals with the issue of how much the issue of international development is more of an electoral rhetoric as opposed to a proper prescriptive development program. So in the sense that, okay, Canada is back in the international space, but how much of this is real and how much of it is more for political domestic consumption? So would somebody like to tackle that one first? Could I ask Chris?
Sure. I'm going to take off my headphones. I think there's a lot of sincerity around wanting Canada to be back on the part of those people who are making those commitments. Although, let's be clear, some of this is linked to Canada's ambitions to secure a Security Council seat later this month. And I think the chances of us taking leadership and investing further in a post-COVID response, global response, probably are enhanced if we actually secure that Security Council seat. If that doesn't happen, it's a little bit of an open question. And I guess our real kind of commitment, our morals, our values will be tested in this regard. And we'll see whether this is electoral virtual signaling versus something that is really much more constructive to the world that we want to create. If we do get a Security Council seat, it does afford us great opportunities for leadership at an important time. And so, it's my hope that we are successful in all of that. That, of course, has to be matched by not just the government's presence and voice on the Security Council, but by a broader, I think, Canadian response of civil society, global civil society, our global partners, and the private sector as well. So my hope is that if the government wins that seat, if Canada wins that seat,
that the government takes that whole of Canada approach to engaging the world on this set of issues, challenges that we face.
Yeah, there was a follow-up question, follow-up statement that that development and along with some other policy objectives don't seem to win elections. So that's something that we have to work on as a country. There's a small question for Sheila, actually, requesting the name of the Ethiopian leader that you quoted. So Sheila, could you just do that? Could you answer that one straight away?
I'm not sure that she would necessarily, she might be a little bit embarrassed, but her name is Sigi Hali, and she is the director of WISE, the Women in Self-Employment Organization based out of Addis in Ethiopia, and an executive director of an incredible organization, very small scale, doing amazing work with women entrepreneurs in very small scale women entrepreneurs in urban and peri-urban areas. Long time partner with a number of Canadian organizations and others.
So back to you, actually, Fadi, would you like to chip in with respect to this issue? I mean, we often talk about development aid as being Canada's soft initiative, soft power initiative, as it were. You've had a lot of experience. So with respect to that, can you add to that? I can't hear you.
I think, no, I'm not on mute. I'm on thinking. I think there's a lot of opportunities that could open up for us as Canadians when we invest in global contexts, when we lend a hand, and that these opportunities could stimulate different industries, different businesses, different ideas for Canadians or for Canada in general. And it starts with being plugged into different contexts, contributing, and just creating a capacity, whether it's from a political system, political infrastructure, from volunteering, from economic development, or contributing in different ways. So I do think there is a lot of opportunities for aid to be used as a vehicle of influence, and it's yeah, I'm not really sure what the question was, but I think aid can be used as a mean for influence and participation in other countries.
Thanks. You know, the word partnership has been stressed over and over again, and the need to be more multilateral. So Chris, I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the innovative partnership in a major project that WUSC is part of with a lot of other partners, funded by the Canadian government. And it's, can you talk about that just briefly? Yeah,
so I think this is, I'd like to speak about the Equality Fund, of which WUSC is an important partner. This is an initiative that has a significant investment from the Government of Canada, but that is whose money is also going to be commingled with philanthropy as well as investment capital. And the returns on the investment of the Government of Canada's funds and private funds will actually be channeled to women's rights organizations in the Global South. And those funds will go directly in that way. And I think the ability of a significant Canadian government investment is going to tap into a much larger pool of resources to fund women's rights organizations and the women's rights movement globally, making it the largest kind of single women's rights fund in the world. And so I think that's kind of significant. What it kind of points to, it's a model that is of course going to be challenged a little bit by the temporary downturn in the markets, the financial markets, but I think those will come back. What it does also challenge is it challenges the role that we as Canadian organizations play with our partners globally. I think the pandemic crisis has demonstrated to all of us that we can work remotely if we have to. Not necessarily our preferred way of doing so, but we may never go back to the way in which we have worked in the past. And I think in terms of partnership, it also poses some interesting challenges for us, the pandemic, and some interesting opportunities. Because the funds that will be going to women's rights organizations will be used in ways that they decide how to use, without the intermediation of Canadian organizations, without us kind of deciding on and determining what the priorities for those resources should be. And so it really challenges, I think, the role that many Canadian organizations, and certainly my own, maybe not all of those represented here today, play in terms of how we think about the partnerships that we have with organizations, governments, and the private sector in other parts of the world.
I mean, if I'm right, I think Government of Canada's committed, what, 300 million for that?
Yes, that's right. 300 million. And our goal is to generate over $1 billion worth of grant making over the next 10 years for women's rights organizations. And
I think one of the partners is RBC, is that right?
Sorry?
One of the partners is RBC.
RBC is a partner. The Toronto Community Foundation is a partner. And then we have quite a few women's rights organizations from a global collective that is there. And then a large number of philanthropists, both Canadian and philanthropists in other countries. The United States has a large representation there of people who are willing to put their money on the table for women's equality. And so it's really significant. What's kind of interesting about it as well is that the Government of Canada is taking a lot of risk in terms of investing in a very, very new model, something they really have never done before. And I think that's to their great credit. I think those are the kinds of innovations, perhaps, that Sheila, you were also alluding to, that we need more of. We don't want these kinds of things to be one-off. We want them to become a more regular way in which I think we tackle some of these global problems and global opportunities. But that means getting beyond kind of a risk-averse kind of approach to how we think about Canadian development assistance.
So if I just shift conversation a little bit to one of the questions that's come in, which is city-to-city diplomacy. And is it time for Canada to repurpose the Twinning Cities initiative? Sheila, would you like to tackle that one?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's, as I mentioned, and I think that what we need to be doing is looking at many different ways in which people are connecting at this point, and particularly connecting in different ways. We found that, I mean, obviously COVID-19 is going to impact international development in incredible ways, but one of those big ways is going to be travel. And so the way that we're connecting using technology and different ways in which we're understanding and increasing our knowledge is going to have to shift. And I think that the city-to-city context is another way to connect people. I don't think it's that or something else or something else. I think anything that we can be doing to connect people in understanding how the issues and the concerns that they face in their own community are similar in some ways and different in other ways to cities and communities elsewhere in the world can only help us understand better other people's realities. People relate to where they come from, and so that's where I think actually cities right now in this world, we need to be thinking much more in terms of communities and cities, and not just in terms of countries. I think one of the things that COVID has taught us is that the response that happens locally is often the best response for that particular area. We've seen that with health systems. We've seen differences in provinces across Canada because of provincial realities, because of city realities. We've seen pressures within Canada to increase funding to cities because it's cities and communities that are facing the most important challenges right now in terms of service delivery. So I think it's a great program. I don't think it's the only way in which we can connect. And I absolutely think that the Equality Fund is an excellent example on a large scale of how bringing together diverse types of stakeholders with aligned interests is very much a benefit to more than just the people involved. And I think we have to be thinking about ways of doing that on different scales as well. That's a huge scale. There's lots of ways in which that can be happening on smaller scales.
Thank you very much. Another question here, in terms of, I'm just going to read it. As a researcher, I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on what some key international development research questions are and what knowledge is needed in the context of COVID-19 and building back better. Anybody like to tackle on?
I guess some of the data that we really need is who is particularly being affected by the crisis, who is falling between the cracks within the societies and communities of which they belong. And what are the coping mechanisms that they have relied upon and the systems that support all of that? And I guess then thinking about what that then means for the rebuilding of those ecosystems and the rebuilding of those coping and thriving mechanisms that people have had in the past. But that basic data of what is happening to people made accessible to people and organizations locally for their collective response, I think is going to be critical to the response that we all mount.
Thanks. Questions come in with respect to something I wasn't aware of, so I'm just going to read it. What does the radical reorganization of Oxfam International signal for civil society engagement in international development post-COVID? Who wants to tackle that one?
Sheila, go ahead. I'll say something too, but Sheila, please.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think if people don't know that Oxfam globally, the global network and Oxfam GB is letting off a few thousand people and closing its offices in 18 countries. And I think what it's finding is that Oxfam itself has been in crisis for some time. And so the COVID crisis is actually pushing those organizations that have been coping with other kinds of crises over the edge, and forcing them to rethink kind of their operational model, their added value, their niche, their footprint globally. And I think that's not only happening with Oxfam, that's happening to a lot of organizations in Canada as well. Our sector is, of course, under tremendous stress because of the COVID crisis and how that affects how we are able to do things and the revenue that we rely upon, whether those be donations or government grants or partnerships of various sorts, that underlies the way in which we work internationally. I think we should not be concerned about any particular organization. Whether my organization survives or not should not be a question for everyone to worry about. It's my worry. But we should be worried about the sector as a whole, the health of the Canadian sector. And we need to think about the enabling environment that Global Affairs Canada and others create to allow the sector to respond effectively. We don't want the hollowing out of our sector at this particular time. At the same time, we as a sector have to be very creative in the ways in which we think about how we partner with new models, new approaches, new ways of doing things as we question kind of what we have done and how we have operated in the past. So Sheila, over to you. Sorry to pontificate. I love this issue though.
Well, I think it's absolutely crucial, and maybe just to augment that a little bit, Oxfam internationally had been thinking about switching their model up anyway as part of a strategic plan that came out a couple of years ago, and I think COVID just accelerated that a little bit. This is what I meant earlier by saying we really need to, as civil society, and particularly Canadian civil society, think differently about our role. And I think what Oxfam is trying to do is to recognize that funding sources are going to be changing but also priorities are going to be changing, and that capacity in a number of their offices has increased. And so really shifting the focus away from northern organizations to southern partners within that alliance is really important. And sometimes as Canadian organizations, we need to think about when can we step up and when can we step back. And I think this is an example of a certain example of kind of stepping back a little bit, not in terms of the importance of the work that we do, but a shifting of the kind of work that we do. And increasingly, I think as Canadian civil society organizations, we're going to be needing to be doing more and more public engagement, helping Canadians understand about what is important about Canadian support for global assistance, and less perhaps hands-on development. We have partners in the Global South who are doing this so effectively. Why would it take a Canadian to be involved with that? So I think this is one of the turning points in international development that is really causing us to think about what do we need to do and how can we do it differently?
So Fadi, I was going to ask you a question with respect to, you talked about the partnerships that you've struck you've struck in the US, for example, Silicon Valley. How did you do that?
That's a really great question. So you, as an organization, you need to understand the problem that you're trying to solve. It is, you don't exist to send volunteers. You don't exist to do X or Y. You exist to solve a particular problem. And then once you understand that problem, then you have to look at your stakeholder network and then think, who cares? Who wants to join me in solving that problem? So when we think about Silicon Valley companies, they're always looking at how do we develop our staff? How do we prepare our staff for the next big thing? How do we get our staff to learn new things in a really low pressure environment? Where is our growth going to come from as Netflix or Hulu or any company? Is our growth going to come from North America, or is our growth going to come from India and other emerging markets? And so they already have the priorities, and compounded with millennials being in the workplace and really needing their employer to have more of a stance on social justice, on values, on showing up to work for something that's a little bit bigger, on meaning. So basically what we did was we created the platform where we allow employees from top Silicon Valley companies to go abroad and volunteer, because we know that they develop their skills and they learn new things. We know that that increases their loyalty to their employer, so they're not just going to take the next call from a recruiter, and that we know that that gives them intel to be able to do their jobs better once they come back. And at the same time, the international community is looking for amazingly skilled people to create real impact when they go on the ground to do international development work. So my first international development project was me in a village in Uganda, moving bricks from one side of the village to the other. And quickly I realized I have a business degree from SMU. Like, I can teach people entrepreneurship, I can teach people how to do a lot of different things, but I was sold on, hey, come here and build an orphanage. And frankly, I don't know how to build anything by hand, and not a lot of people do. So the idea was, how do we understand what skills does a particular sector, for example, we picked tech, because they're usually progressive and they usually offer their employees lots of amazing benefits, including volunteer time off. And then how do we leverage that sector to be a really key player in the international development space?
And just
how do we get them to pay for it?
Yeah. And a follow-up question then is, how important is technology? Because not every country has the technology infrastructure for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So technology has permeated. It might look different in different contexts. So maybe not everyone's sitting on a laptop, but lots of our partners or international colleagues are on a smartphone at least. They are using WhatsApp. They are using low data apps to communicate and connect on a day-to-day basis. So technology is there. And it might look a little bit different, and it might not be to the same extent or the same bandwidth, but there is a minimum, I'd say, acceptable kind of benchmark that you can work within. And when we do tech training and when we do tech empowerment, we always need to understand the local context of the partner that we're working with, and how do we adapt training to fit their context. So a lot of times we're actually doing a lot of mobile related tech rather than kind of what we imagine tech being, whether it's kind of creating a computer lab or setting on a desktop or a laptop to perform a certain function.
Okay, so you've been dealing with the private sector, but another question that's come in, what about government bureaucracy getting in the way, perhaps, of the ideas and innovations that?
Yeah. So I'm an social entrepreneur by nature. So the biggest two questions was, what's the problem that we want to solve, and who's willing to pay for it? So we started the whole thing with bootstrapping, going to companies like Google, Netflix, Apple. And tons of other companies that said no to us. But the idea is just be really, really clear on the problem that you want to solve, and then be really clear on the on your tribe, the community that cares about solving that problem. And then slowly governments will turn around. Once they see the logos on your website, they'll say, hey, we thought of a grant that might be really interesting for you. And we'll say, great, I'll send it to a grant writer because I don't know how to do that. And we should be okay with that, because I'm really good at certain things and not good at other things. And I'm really good at catalyzing the private sector. And there is a conscious corporate movement that has been happening for the last few years. And the employees, I think, are driving that because they're really, really, really interested in kind of merging their amazing skills that are helping Facebook, sell millions and millions of dollars of ads every day through data science, to how do I use the same data formula and algorithm to look at trends to cure cancer. The employees are looking for that, and the companies are following, and we are being a part of that conversation to facilitate that kind of millennial drive towards value-based work and value-based engagement in life.
So we're getting close to 5 o'clock here in Halifax. Another question for either Chris or Shelagh, with respect to focus, country focus or region focus. I mean, Canada, we're a big country geographically, but economically, we're probably around about 7th or 9th in the world. So what about country focus or region focus? We can't do everything. We can't solve all the problems of the world. So which one of you would like to jump in on that one?
I think for a long time, CETA, GFAT-D, GAC had particular countries of focus as a way of really being able to be an effective developer of aid, because of that requirement that you can't work everywhere, you actually have to work in particular areas. That I think things have shifted a little bit, and the focus has switched from countries to feminist. And so it's no longer about particular countries, it's about supporting those who are taking a very particular gender equality approach to international development. Personally, I think that's a much more effective way of doing it. But that's the government's response. I think where we want to encourage those outside the government, NGOs, civil society, academic institutions, private sector, etc., is to make a connection somehow that makes sense to you. And so what we can do again is have a government response that's with a particular focus, that is supported by and is supporting civil society that is responding in different ways that make sense. And one of the things that I think is going to be really important these days, just to pick up on a point that Fadi made, is that one of the roles that civil society can be playing is a little bit of a broker or a connector. There are organizations, private sector, philanthropic organizations that are more interested in international development than we think. And there are organizations that can connect those who are looking for particular sources of funding with those who actually have the money. And that's one of the things, again, about the Equality Fund, which is kind of doing that. It's sort of who are the people to bring that social entrepreneurship focus on it? What is it that's trying to be resolved, and how can the funding be made? I think we need people in between that who can make those connections right now. And that's something that we need to be doing a lot more of, rather than depending on other people to do that for us.
Thank you. There's a lot of comments here and questions in the importance of grassroots as opposed to top down. But perhaps there's a last comment you can make. Question here with respect to the vaccine, development of a vaccine for COVID-19 as a global common good, particularly with respect to the global south. So what do you think of that as a concept? Anybody want to chip in on that one?
Sure. I think it is a global common good. There's the question then of how do you fund or organize global common goods so that everyone has access to them? And of course, there's questions about access in the short term versus, like the sequencing of who gets what first. But beyond those kinds of issues, there is, of course, questions related to intellectual property rights, and so coming up with ways of developing vaccines such that those kinds of restrictions, at least in the short term, are not the kinds of things that inhibit the wide-scale distribution of vaccines. There's additional financial mechanisms that governments and multilateral agencies and private foundations, the Gates Foundations has certainly done in terms of guaranteeing kind of a market and a payout for vaccine development. So there's other ways of doing all of that. I think the challenge to the global public good that is being developed, though, at the moment is politics. And I think what we have to be very careful about is ensuring that politics doesn't get in the way of making whatever vaccine that is developed a global public good that everyone has access to. I would link that then back to one of the roles that Canada could play if, and even if it doesn't become a member of the Security Council, because I think this is something that we need to show some leadership on.
Thanks very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a little after 5 o'clock here in Halifax. So I do want to thank our panelists and thank you, the audience, for being part of this. The issues that we've discussed this afternoon are key for Canada, but not just for Canada, the key for the world. And we as global citizens have our own role to play. Some of the comments that have come in on the Q&A in the chat have related to how can I get involved? What about scholarships, more scholarships for young people from countries, particularly in the global south? But also picking up on Fadi's comment of having a global international development ecosystem for Canada. Canada is being part then of a global ecosystem and linking then in on a multilateral way. But also the importance, again, of some of the questions and comments I've seen of grassroots. This is not just a top-down neoliberal order. This is something that we all are part of. And I would sort of say we have a global social compact. We have a commitment. We have something that we just have to be part of and share. And I think partnerships is a word that's come over again. Innovation, of course, is there. And there's so many projects that Canada has been part of, and I've seen, that are innovative solutions. The question is, of course, how are this going to be affected with the pandemic? Are we still going to have the volunteers willing to spend time in a country beyond Canada? What about the travel restrictions, etc.? I mean, there's so many different questions here. So I do want to now close this off. Do we have the results of the two polls? Yeah.
Of course.
99%. No surprise there. We were talking just before.
That one person.
And what about the second question? %87%. There was a comment, you know, that perhaps some of our Canadian aid is too self-serving. So I wanted to make that mention that there was also a question then in terms of our trade dependence on the US. Well, you know, that's something that we've been trying to diversify over the years. It used to be 85, 87% trade exports to the US. Now it's about 73%. So we're making progress on that. So again, to our three panelists, I want to thank you so much to that, for everybody joining us, to CIC and the Atlantic Council for International Cooperation for bringing this all together. So from Halifax, sunny Halifax, about 20 degrees, something like that. I don't know for the rest of you. I think Chris was saying Ottawa is being hot and sunny today. So that gives us some optimism for the summer. But I do want to thank you all for being part of this. Canada's role is, I think, critical in this, but we have to do it together. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being part of this. And I think we can now close this. And it has been recorded, so I would suggest that if you want to pass this on. Someone mentioned Facebook before. We've been live on Facebook as well. So thank you very much indeed to everyone. I think we can all sign off now.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Fadi and Shelagh. Nice seeing you all. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.